rather than anything else. So hopefully that's all working okay. Shut that over there. Right. Okay. So yes, as Kathleen said, I'm Catherine Arundel. I'm a senior research fellow. I'm assistant director of York Trials Unit based at the University of York. I'm also the TMRP trial conduct co-lead and have extensive experience in methodological studies within trials. We have worked, for a long time with Trial Forge, headed by Sean Truick up at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And through that, we've developed the Trial Forge SWAT Network, which is the component of that I lead. So hopefully today's session will give you a little bit of an insight into what studies within a trial are, why they're important, and how we maybe can think about going about doing them. So just briefly in summary before we get started. So as I've just alluded to, we'll go through what a SWAT is, why they're important, and then think about some of the kind of key things that you need to think about if you were considering embedding a study within a trial or a SWAT within your research. So those of you on the call that are experienced in trial conduct are probably used to seeing graphs like this on the right-hand side of the screen. We quite often set out when we do trials with the best intentions. We've really thought hard about our sample size and our recruitment trajectory, but then ultimately find that that doesn't quite go according to plan, and sometimes we need to extend the study beyond the original time point that we have. Recruitment to target is known to be difficult, and it has been for quite a long time now. Trial recruitment often sits at sort of 40 to 50% of target, with them requiring an extension. So it's still a real problem, and as I say, it's been perennial for a good number of years. Similarly, even if we get patients into studies, we have to also think, as you'll be aware, of retention. That leads, if we don't retain patients in the study, that leads to missing outcome data, affects generalizability, validity, and reliability of the results that we've worked so hard to get. And a paper by one of my colleagues here at York, Catherine Hewitt, back a number of years ago now, but still rings true, is that approximately a quarter of trials experience attrition of more than 10%, meaning that primary outcome data isn't available for the analyses. Now, obviously, we account for that in the sample size, but it's still quite a stark number, really, to think about. Because we've got these two real challenges in terms of trial delivery, we quite often use different strategies to improve recruitment and retention. So you might think, you might be using newsletters or incentives or enticing cover letter or an SMS prompt, perhaps in trials that you're working on, to try and improve and engage patients with the research. There is, however, limited evidence for a lot of those strategies, particularly in recruitment and retention. And then when we think about other trial processes, there are even fewer evaluations. So for things like how we monitor a trial or how we perhaps collect outcome data, and things like that have even less evidence to support them. And that's where a study within a trial can come in. So what is a SWAT? I'm hoping this will work. There we go. Hopefully you can hear that.
To make clinical, we need to use good methodology. To test which methods work best, researchers can do a study within a trial, called a SWAT. A SWAT is a smaller research study often contained within a randomised controlled trial. SWATs may also be referred to as a sub-trial or sub-study, a nested or embedded trial, or a trial within a trial. SWATs can be used to investigate specific stages of a trial methodology, such as recruitment, retention, or data analysis. For example, SWATs have assessed whether using video and paper participant information together increases recruitment, or whether sending text message reminders for trial questionnaires improves completion rates. Why are SWATs important? SWATs help researchers identify the best research methods. Healthcare professionals rely on evidence when treating patients. This evidence comes from studies such as randomised controlled trials. Researchers should also use evidence when deciding how to run a trial. However, this evidence is often limited. SWATs can help researchers pick the best ways to conduct trials, meaning more accurate research results and less time and resources are wasted. The findings from multiple SWATs can be combined to provide stronger evidence about effective and ineffective trial methods, making trials more suitable for participants to join and stay involved with. Key features of a SWAT. It is contained within a host trial. It can be built in from the start of the trial or added later. It can be randomised or non-randomised. It should not affect the reliability, rationale, or outcomes of the host trial. It can benefit the host trial by improving methods used. It can be repeated across numerous host trials at the same time, or at different time points. The effective use of SWATs should produce better trials and a more efficient use of time and resources. SWATs, small studies playing a big role in making clinical trials better.
So hopefully that gives you quite a nice, allusion to what a SWAT is. And we'll just reshare my slides now because I think that's kicked us out. Hang on a minute. There we go. That's back where we are. So that hopefully has given you a nice idea of where or what a SWAT is. So as the animation there beautifully kind of alluded to. So a SWAT is a self-contained research study embedded within a host trial. You might hear other terms that are for similar methodological sort of approaches, so things like trials within a cohort or TWICs, SWARs, studies within a review, and studies within a project as well. They are slightly different in their intent, but are again sort of similarly sitting around that methodological focus. You'll also perhaps hear sometimes SWATs being referred to as nested trials, trials within trials, embedded trials, lots of terms, but essentially we're talking about the same thing with many of those terms, and we'll just touch on that a little bit more in a moment. SWATs, the vast majority of evidence, and again we'll reflect on this shortly, are focused on recruitment and retention. They're relatively new as a method, but have been around in various different guises for a long time, and certainly here in York we've been doing SWATs as part of our routine kind of trials work for quite a long time now. SWATs can use a range of methods, so they're not just randomised, they don't have to be. They can also be qualitative, mixed methods, and we'll touch on, again, the importance of thinking about the suite of kind of research options that are available when doing a SWAT as we move through the presentation today. And as I've mentioned, they can be randomised, so or non-randomised, depending on your question in hand. As I've mentioned, SWATs often focus on recruitment and retention interventions, but can focus on any process in the trial. And ultimately, if we can get things right in terms of recruitment, retention, and other trial processes, this is going to have a huge impact on the research that we do. So, for example, the recovery COVID-19 trial, it was found subsequently that only 10% of eligible patients were recruited. If that study had been better able to identify, screen, and recruit those patients into the trial, it was likely that interventions could have been adopted earlier, and therefore that recruitment could potentially have saved lives within that pandemic. So trying to find ways to improve recruitment and retention are an important thing for all of us to consider, irrespective of our roles within trials. So the main aim of a SWAT is to resolve those uncertainties about how we do trials. We know what we need to do to run a trial. We know that we need to have a sample size and write a protocol and design our data collection, but we don't necessarily know the best ways to do this. As the animation mentioned, SWATs are embedded within a host trial, but it's really important that those don't affect the integrity of the host trial. There's quite sometimes nervousness from other groups involved, other stakeholders in a trial, sponsors, the study team, the research ethics committee, for example, about embedding a SWAT. So it's really important that we think critically about what we're doing so we don't affect the integrity of the host trial. SWATs will inform how we do future trials. Absolutely. We're evaluating strategies and, as the animation again mentioned, pooling that data together to answer the question in full. But ultimately, there is the opportunity that this might inform some decisions about your host trial. So, for example, doing a SWAT in a pilot phase allows you to think about strategies to use in your main trial. Or equally, if your study is quite big and is going along for quite a long time, then you might be able to reach a decision at a midpoint and then embed what looks to be an effective strategy into your trial more generally. As has been alluded to, many SWATs are just too small to identify an answer in a single study. But preferably we want to run that across a number of different trials, which then brings in the power of meta-analysis. Because we're looking for really small changes in recruitment and retention in SWATs. We need quite significant numbers of participants in those, and usually host trials just can't afford that. We're constrained by the number of patients we're recruiting or retaining, or aiming to retain, I should perhaps say. And so meta-analysis is really key to building that SWOT evidence. So I've alluded there to what a SWOT is, but I think it's also important to reflect on what a SWOT is not, because certainly in my experience as a trial manager, many of the clinicians that I have worked with will talk about all sorts of things being a SWOT. So, for example, comparing assessment of perhaps a joint condition or a fracture, using X-ray versus MRI, or comparing the ability to look at biological changes through blood or urine sampling, evaluating whether a questionnaire has validity in the patient population, or looking at service delivery. Things like that quite often get labelled to be a SWOT, but really we are very much thinking about SWOTs being focused on trial processes, so not clinical outcomes, but trial processes. And that similarly applies to qualitative studies, where those qualitative studies are exploring the trial or the study in relation to the impact on clinical outcomes. So, for example, exploring patients' perceptions of the intervention, or how the intervention has impacted their quality of life, for example. That really isn't a SWOT, but we could use qualitative processes as a SWOT to explore reasons why patients aren't recruited or retained into trials. So it's really important to think cautiously about how we kind of use language when we're talking about SWOTs. As I say, SWOTs are very much about the trial methods and processes and how we design, conduct, deliver, and disseminate trials, rather than the more clinical elements of a research study. So in terms of the current evidence, as I've already alluded to, most SWOTs that are published out there are focused on recruitment and retention strategies. And this timeline sort of nicely depicts the progress that has been made over the last 20 years. We're a little bit further on now. I should probably update this slide. But ultimately, we've seen quite significant increases in the number of SWOTs over a 10-year period. But ultimately, we're still a little way off answering many of those questions. The rise in the number of SWOTs has been largely due to particular funding streams, things like MRC Start, which was one of the first to kind of focus on SWOTs, right the way through with yourselves over in Ireland with the HRBT MRN, Trial Forge, National Institute of Health and Care Research in the UK, colleagues in Canada, and also the Prometheus programme as well, which was conducted by us here in York. So lots of work going on, lots of impact, and numbers are increasing. But as I say, we don't still know what works and what doesn't in the context of recruitment, let alone anything else that we're doing in trials. So the current evidence, which is based on two systematic reviews, one for recruitment strategies and one for retention strategies. Your recruitment strategy, or most recent iteration of this, found 68 randomised and quasi-randomised evaluations of just 3 interventions that were supported by high certainty grade evidence. So open trials versus placebo trials, so patients knowing what they're going to receive versus the trial being completely blinded. sending telephone reminders to patients who don't respond to, or delivering a telephone reminder to patients who don't respond to a postal invitation, and a bespoke user-tested patient information sheet. So very small numbers of trials that have any real certainty there. And that review is currently being updated into what we're hoping will be a living systematic review by my colleague, Dr. Adwa Parker, here in York, who's currently undertaking a senior fellowship to do exactly that. So the evidence base there may well have changed, but that's the current published evidence that we have. Similarly, we have the review for retention strategies, so 70 randomised evaluations in there, but no interventions have high certainty evidence of grade standard. So we have nothing really that we can say definitely doesn't work or definitely does work in the context of retaining participants. There are 3 promising strategies, albeit, so using self-sampling kits for clinical outcomes that can be self-sampled, monetary rewards with a reminder or pre-notification, and pens with postal questionnaires. There's also one that's not so promising, that is the use of diaries to help with patient kind of recording of events that happen, where the suggestion is that perhaps doesn't make any difference to patient retention. So the animation also alluded, but I just thought it was important at this point to just really demonstrate what I mean by a SWAT. So I've put an example here, which is a study of mine that's recently completed, which was looking at whether providing an infographic, so a nice visual depiction of the study, single side of A4, nice coloured sheet, alongside a patient information sheet helps to improve recruitment. And we did that in a study of patients who had recent surgery where their wounds were left open to heal and who were recruited face-to-face in a clinic setting. And we either gave patients the infographic with the information sheet or gave them just the REC-approved information sheet to look at recruitment rate and also the proportions of ineligibility, largely irrelevant, but proportions of eligible and non-consenting, which was, and cost effectiveness as well. So hopefully that sets the scene in terms of what a SWAT is and what we're talking about today in this webinar. So why are SWATs important? So I've seen this quote used a couple of times by my colleague Sean Truick up in Aberdeen, and I think it really, speaks well to why SWATs are important. So when we do trials to generate evidence to improve patient outcomes. But we conduct trials like anecdotal medicine. We do what we think works, we rely on experience and judgment, and there's limited data to support those best practices. So although we're trying to do the absolute best gold standard in terms of the design and how we evaluate clinical outcomes, the way that we're doing it is still pretty shoddy in terms of the evidence that supports some of the decisions that we make. So I would therefore argue that we should apply the same thinking that we use for clinical intervention assessment to research methodology in order to prevent research waste. We should be thinking strategically and testing the processes so that we know we can use what works, not use what doesn't work, and therefore prevent the fact that we end up having trials that struggle to recruit, have to have an extension, possibly a closed, or studies that ultimately can't follow up enough patients and therefore fall short of their sample size, we're giving reduced power in the analysis. By doing SWATs, SWATs are important in helping us to conduct better trials. We should be doing the best methods as well as the best kind of ultimate research. And that ultimately leads us to be more efficient in our use of time and resources. As we looked at that graph in the first slide of the presentation, extending a trial is additional time, it's additional resource. And actually, if we could even cut for example, an extension by 50% time and resource, that would be a huge saving and a huge benefit to everyone that's involved in trials, from patients through to clinicians, through to academics. So that's why SWATs are important in general. But perhaps for those of you on the call, you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good. I can see why they are important, but why should I embed a SWAT in my research. So I would really encourage you to think about this. By embedding a SWAT, you're helping to contribute to build the evidence base. And you're developing evidence-based methods for trial processes that will either inform current or future work. It's going to help improve processes, efficiency, and reduce research waste. The real benefit of doing things like this is there's a huge network of people out there already that are interested in this area. They're doing some of these SWATs, so they can offer you advice and experience. They can offer you examples of protocols and interventions. It's not that you have to start from the bottom and think the whole thing through yourselves. There's lots of resources and support out there, one of which is the Trial Forge SWAT Network. By collaborating, that also helps us to improve our own practice. We're sharing knowledge and learning as well, and tackling the difficulties that we all face collectively. Sharing that expertise on design and conduct and delivery is a huge part of that as well. If you're an early career researcher, or perhaps in study at the moment, then these also really offer a nice opportunity for career development. So these could perhaps be master's level projects. When I did my master's in health research a number of years ago now, my master's project was a SWAT, and it gave me the opportunity to design an intervention, to test effectively a mini randomised trial and do the analysis in what was a relatively safe environment. So a really nice opportunity at master's level, but also in terms of early career publications as well. This is something that you, perhaps as an early career researcher, can take the lead on designing, implementing and delivering, and therefore ultimately can result, for many early career researchers as an author-led publication, which is hugely beneficial when you think about, career development in an academic context. We've also had individuals who have done these on PhDs as well. So huge sort of range of options there to think about. So if we move on then, we've talked about what and why. So let's think about the how. How do we actually go about doing this? We know from work that we've done with the Trial Forge SWAT Network that for a lot of people that are unfamiliar with SWATs, this feels like, as much as it feels like a trial, it feels like a little bit of an alien concept as well, and we absolutely understand that. So hopefully this will give you some useful information and tips in kind of thinking about how you might want to embed something like this. So first and foremost, the general things to consider. Well, you're going to need a host trial. It goes without saying. It's a study within a trial, an embedded trial. Often that's a pragmatic trial, and it's usually going to be your own trial, whatever trial you're working on in whatever role you're involved with. But it could be that of a collaborator as well. It might be that you've got a colleague that's doing the study, and you've got a really good idea for a SWOT, and it just works really well in that context. So host trial, number one thing that you need. Embedding a SWOT as soon as possible in the design process is always a benefit. Partly, if you're thinking about that at grant application stage, then you can think about costs. We'll come on to that in a moment. But also you can start that the earliest possible opportunity, and therefore maximise the contribution that you're making to that evidence base. But that's not to say that you can't implement one later on. You can embed at any stage. It's never too late to implement a SWOT. So perhaps you're sat here on the webinar today thinking, well, I've just got a study that's in recruitment. Great, I can put that right in at the start. Brilliant. Think about doing that. You might have a study that's just about to hit the end of recruitment. So what can we think about in a retention context? Or even if you've got a trial that's coming to the end of its follow-up, can we think about a SWOT around dissemination of results? There's all sorts of opportunities to kind of embed one. So it's never too late. You'll always need to consider the costs. If you're thinking about this from the outset, that's always beneficial, because that means that you can cost things into your grant applications. So there's a range of funding opportunities, I know, through HRB Ireland and the HRB TMRN around sort of funded trials to embed a SWOT and SWOT calls, which is brilliant. And for those that perhaps straddle across into the UK, the NIHR also offer similar sort of support at a grant application stage to embed and conduct a SWOT. If you're thinking about embedding a SWAT later on in a trial, then of course you need to think about the costs and being able to accommodate that. But as we'll come to talk about when we think about the intervention, that perhaps is easier than you think. Don't forget if you are costing upfront to think about your direct costs and your indirect costs as well. So it's not just about the printing of an infographic or the development of an animation, for example, but also the time that takes to do that, the randomization work that has to happen, the analysis at the end. As in any study, you need to have a formal protocol, just like the host trial. How you kind of do that is varied. That can be a standalone protocol or embedded in the host trial. And again, as we'll come to talk about, there's lots of examples out there as well, which will be helpful. And you'll usually need ethical approval. Most of the work that goes on in the SWAT field, certainly in recruitment and retention, is patient focused. So we'll need ethical approval in order to amend documentation. So one of the first things that you're going to want to think about, much like in a trial, is what your intervention is going to be. So most SWATs can fit within existing trials infrastructure. So are there issues that you're aware of in a trial already? Are you struggling with recruitment? Are you finding that patients perhaps are not understanding about the need to be followed up at every time point? Is there a SWAT that you could put in there, or could you amend the information sheet to see if that helps? Are patients struggling to engage with the information sheet? Can you reformat that in a different way? So think about what's going on in your trial. Are there things that you're doing that you could make a small tweak to? Could you change the invitation email or cover letter? Could you change the wording of a text message reminder? Can you send a different type of incentive? You're already doing those things. So are there minor tweaks that you can make that allow you to test a slightly different alternative? Consider a whole range of other opportunities to identify SWATs. So there is or has recently been developed by the Trial Forge SWAT Centre and the Implement SWATs programme conducted by my colleague Adjoa Parker, a list of priority SWATs, and those are based on interventions that are widely used but where evidence is limited. So for example, for recruitment, looking at video information provision or postal invitations, looking at qualitative evaluation of barriers and facilitators. And then in terms of retention, data collection methods, use of reminders, use of routine data are all examples of that. And across both, things like whether we can improve PPI input to improve recruitment and retention of participants in the trial, and what we can better do to recruit underserved groups. So there's a suite of questions there already waiting to be answered that need to be answered. So that's quite a nice place to start and maybe get you thinking. There's also priority 1 and priority 2 work that was done a number of years ago now. So some of these are a little bit more general. They don't necessarily lead to a specific SWAT question in terms of the intervention, but can be quite helpful in thinking about where you might want to put your resource. The SWAT repository, and I've put the links there for you. And these slides will, I understand, be circulated as well. So the repository shows what ideas largely have been registered. There is a link via the Trial Forge website, this bottom link in point 2, that shows the current status of each of those SWATs. So that allows you to see if a SWAT was just an idea that's never actually come to anything, or something that's perhaps ongoing, or even in the rare instance, SWATs that are now, we feel, sufficiently answered. On that website, the benefit is that if there is any available information, then you are able to download that from the SWAT information itself. So that might be the protocol that's being used for it. That might be examples of the intervention or publications or statistical analysis plans. So it offers you an opportunity, if you're thinking about doing a particular SWAT in a particular sort of area, to almost take those off the shelf and use those as a starting point at the very least. It's also really important to register any ideas that you've got or anything that you're doing in there, so others can replicate that and hopefully help to build replications and therefore meta-analysis. So would encourage you to do that if you've got ideas that aren't already in that repository. Similarly, I should say that as a Trial Forge SWAT Centre, we have huge experience in undertaking studies within trials and are always happy to share that advice and knowledge. So you're more than welcome to reach out to us at Trial Forge SWAT Centre here in York if that is helpful as well. And those just there to summarise the Trial Forge priority questions. I'll just stop there for a moment just so that you can take those in. I'm not going to sit and read them for you. The other important thing to think about when you're picking an intervention is whether another replication is needed. And I hope you've gleaned from what I've said so far that in the general context, yes, we probably need another replication. We're still not quite there with answering any of these questions. It is important though that we avoid research waste, and so we don't want to continue to replicate the same SWAT in the same host population or condition because we're not getting that nice spread of information. So important to think about whether there are missing pieces in the evidence around particularly that balance of participants and host trials in order to help to boost that evidence base and close the question off. So Trial Forge SWAT Guidance 2 suggests using grade, cumulative evidence, context, balance and value of information as a recent addition in order to identify if a further study is needed. That can be helpful, but ultimately we're trying as part of the living systematic review to also understand where we feel that enough evidence has been made available through that both and some additional work that my colleague Adjua Parker is doing to look at where we say enough is enough. But ultimately, there's lots of things that still haven't got enough evidence. So, really the world is your oyster, for want of a phrase. Where evidence is accumulating, however, evidence packs can be helpful to outline where replications might be needed. So there are a few of these now now available via the Trial Forge website. So just to kind of show a couple of these here, so you can see the evidence pack at the top, which is retention. So adding a pen with a postal questionnaire. We have pretty moderate certainty evidence, for the general population, but high certainty evidence for an older population. Most of the replications of that are in an older population. And so we can say that, we think that it's probably a reasonable decision to send a pen to a participant if you're sending out a postal questionnaire. Whereas a recruitment letter highlighting health risks, particular ethnic groups, we don't have real good grade evidence for that at the moment. There's low certainty in a very specific population and very low certainty for the rest of the populations. So the recommendation is further evaluation in a SWAT to diversify that pool and build that grade evidence. So these can be a useful suite as well of documents to kind of have a look at via the Trial Forge website if you're thinking about replicating something and there is an evidence pack already. In terms of designing your SWAT, so important to just reflect on this as well. So as was mentioned earlier on in the webinar, SWATs can be conducted individually. So this is a one-off testing of the SWAT, and then other people may do that at some point in the future. So that's testing an intervention in a single host trial, therefore needs multiple replications and subsequent meta-analysis, and is often used or best used when testing very simple strategies or where we need to test in a specific population. So for example, just finding that one last little puzzle piece to complete the evidence set. There are more efficient ways of doing SWATs though, and that comes with coordination. So individual coordinated, so testing the same intervention in multiple host trials staged over a period using the same or a similar protocol. And that's often best used in a dedicated programme of work or where collaboration is feasible. We can then take it one step further and go to what we call a coordinated SWAT. So that's where we test the same intervention in multiple host trials at the same time with one protocol, ethical approval, analysis, and write-up. That requires significant coordination and is often best for evaluating, complex or costly strategies. So, for example, in an individual trial, the example I gave earlier on around the use of infographics is a good example. We've done that in one trial. Somebody elsewhere is doing one that I'm aware of. We've maybe done another one, but they're quite sporadic in terms of when they've been conducted. The individual coordinated, so for example, I have sort of set off on a programme of work looking at whether thank you cards help to improve retention and have purposely embedded that in each of the trials that I've done over the last sort of 5 or so years with the aim of diversifying and completing multiple replications to try and, hopefully, build that evidence. And then finally with coordinated SWATs, some of you may be aware of a publication that went into one of the BMJ Christmas editions a couple of years ago, again conducted by us here in York, but was whether Christmas cards make any difference, or festive greeting cards, maybe I should say, made any difference to patient retention. So spoiler alert, for if you do send festive greetings cards to your participants in trials, it's probably not worth doing. It doesn't make much difference to retention. What I would say just with this, is a range of options, will usually get us over the line. It doesn't mean that you all absolutely have to do, things with coordination, but I would really encourage you to think about whether it's possible to do that. So are you conducting a number of trials where actually an intervention could be quite easily embedded into multiple trials that you're involved with? Are there colleagues, perhaps you're part of a group, in your organisation where you could all collaborate and all put the same thing into your individual different studies? Are there other groups that you can collaborate with, for example, the SWAT Network or through HRB TMRN or the UK TMRP, for example? Lots of different ways to collaborate, but I would really sort of encourage you to think about what the opportunities are for collaboration locally, and to explore that in terms of adding SWATs into your trials routinely. I mentioned earlier on that SWATs can be randomised or non-randomised, and that very much depends on the question that you're asking. If you're testing an intervention, then randomisation probably is the best way to go, and it's likely needed. But if you're exploring a process, or perhaps drivers for reasons why patients choose not to consent or retain, then randomisation perhaps is less likely if we're thinking more about a qualitative evaluation. The use of individual versus cluster randomisation, if you are randomising a SWAT, also very much depends on the participant. So if the intervention focuses on participants, you're going to probably want to individually randomise. If your intervention is focusing on sites, then cluster randomisation might be better. So again, it's similar sort of thinking to that you would do when you were designing a trial. The randomisation can be separate or it can be combined. The benefit of adding your SWAT in at the start of a trial is that you can perhaps combine the trial randomisation and SWAT randomisation in one. It doesn't have to be the same method as the host trial either. So it might be that you're individually randomising patients for your host trial, but you're ultimately going to cluster randomise your SWAT because you're going to ask will have 50% of your sites using one version of a document and 50% using a different version. I've already alluded to earlier on as well about sample size. So that's usually constrained by the host trial. So if we're thinking about a recruitment SWAT, it's constrained by the number of patients that we ultimately are going to approach in order to reach our recruitment number. And for retention, it's constrained by the actual sample size that's ultimately being achieved and recruited. There's often a lot of question about sample size calculation, and because of the small effect sizes and the need for meta-analysis, we very much suggest that separate power calculations and sample size calculations aren't relevant in the context of a SWAT. The benefit is, of course, meta-analysis and bringing all of that evidence together with those multiple replications to increase the power and ultimately, find compelling evidence for intervention effectiveness or not. When we think about outcomes, these are probably not going to be unsurprising. So in terms of recruitment, perhaps thinking about eligible patients that have consented, consented participants that have been randomised, and cost would be my kind of first three picks for outcomes for a recruitment SWAT. For retention, proportion of participants retained, data completeness, use of reminders, time to response, and cost as well are sensible sort of directions of travel in terms of your outcomes. If you're able to do it with a recruitment SWAT, it's always really, or can be really useful to also consider the impact that intervention has on retention. So that may be a second analysis or a second publication, but ultimately, does a different information sheet not only make a difference to bringing patients into the trial, but also keeping the patients in can be really helpful. So useful to think about sort of adding extra value by analysing not just the immediacy of the impact of a recruitment intervention, but also the longer term impacts as well. In terms of conducting a SWAT, so as I mentioned earlier, research ethics committees frequently ask about consent or information provision. Asking patients to provide consent or providing information about a SWAT has the potential to jeopardise it. It dilutes the effect. You've got Hawthorne effect or resentful demoralisation potentially coming in. And so on that reason, we usually try to remove the need for consent and information provision. And that's particularly relevant in recruitment SWATs where you've not even consented your patient to the main trial yet, let alone consenting them to whether they want to receive information sheet A or information sheet B. It's therefore really important to clarify the who, what, when, and how. So who does this affect? What's happening? When does it happen? And how does it happen? And also to note similar precedents. And this is where that resource and the repository comes back into play. Are there other studies that have already done this without the need to consent or provide information that we can say, well, look, this SWAT's been done two or three times, for example, and each of them didn't require it because it was low risk. So why do you now feel that you need to or want us to go that extra mile with that? Discuss the consent requirements with your PPI group as well. It's really important to do that and think about whether existing consent does cover that. So if the host trial consent form, for example, consents follow up with patients by a range of different methods, then that probably will cover anyway the fact that you might be approaching the patient with a newsletter as well as a questionnaire or using a different cover letter, for example. And as I mentioned before, the SWAT repository, really important to register what you're doing. Let us know if you're replicating something or if you've got a new idea. Really helpful to know what's going on in the landscape so that we can make sure that we're maximising our efforts to answering some of these questions as quickly as possible. A few final little bits and pieces then. So when you're conducting a SWAT, it's really important to think about intervention fidelity as well. So monitoring that or the adherence. So to illustrate the point, a SWAT intervention where you've got automated text messaging prompts being sent out to some participants ahead of the questionnaire being distributed. You need within that to think about, to check whether that is working as you expect it to do, but also upfront at the outset, consider how you're going to monitor that, what your contingency strategies are if things like, for example, the patient provides an incorrect phone number or expresses a desire to stop receiving those SMS messages, for example. So really important to think about that. And it particularly comes when you think about interventions that are delivered at a cluster level, where you as the trial team don't have necessarily the involvement about it. So infographics, for example, sending a wad of infographics out to a participating site is all well and good, but do we actually know that they've been used with the patients each and every time? So think about how you're going to track that to really make sure that this is robust. In terms of analysis and reporting, again, much like your main trial, an analysis plan is required, and we would encourage you to think about outcomes and analysis methods like those in existing evidence or replications to help the combination of results via meta-analysis. Costs or cost analysis should be undertaken at a very minimum, the breakdown of costs, and if a positive effect is detected, irrespective of statistical significance, then we'd encourage cost analyses, and there's links available there in terms of how to do that if you need. Publication of these results is also important, and that's not just necessarily at the meta-analysis level, but publishing individual replications as they happen, be that with or without coordination, is really important because that helps us, particularly in the context of developing things like living systematic reviews, to see that evidence accumulating and to be able to say, when we're reaching decisions around effectiveness. As a trial manager, I know that these publications sometimes, don't hit the top of the priority list. Absolutely understand that. You're being pulled by the funder perhaps to write your final report. You've got the big results paper to get out, and then you move on to a different trial or a different research project, and that then just comes down the priority list. We have, however, made a guidance document, Trial Forge Guidance 4, that we hope helps make SWATs reporting easier and therefore quicker to do and to get that publication out into the wider research community. So just to show an example here, this is what this looks like. So the key thing, for those maybe thinking about writing SWATs or up as publications, as you can see here in the italicized text, this is a cut and paste. Take that sentence, stick it into your paper, amend the bits that are relevant to your trial, move on to the next section. We hope that by providing some standardized wording or at least guidance of what to write, that makes things easier for you. I'm not going to dwell hugely on this next slide, but just really to flag the importance of process evaluation. As in trials, doing a SWAT in the context that I've talked about today identifies if an intervention works or not, but doesn't identify why it does or doesn't. The missing puzzle piece from a lot of the kind of SWAT work that's ongoing is this idea of process evaluation. So they are rarely done, but you may be able to consider efficiencies around that. For example, is there an existing qualitative sub-study that's going on where you could embed some questions about how did you find receiving, a voucher or a e-voucher or a physical voucher at follow-up? What did you think of the patient information sheet that you received? Things like that you might be able to embed elsewhere to fulfill this process evaluation component without actually adding any additional work. So coming through now to the end of the presentation. So just to give you some sort of top tips just to finish off. So start small, test a change to an existing document or process that you're already doing. Find something where you can make a small change and evaluate a couple of different options. Consider a collaborative approach for the very reasons that I've talked about in terms of maximising efficiency. Use existing SWAT resources. So there are protocol templates available for all of those priority SWATs that I talked about. There's also availability of a range of resources for those that are in the repository where we've been able to collate those from those that register the SWATs in the initial instance. Resource your SWAT up front if you can, and think about your costs and your time for this. One of the biggest barriers to SWATs is capacity, so thinking about this early on can be helpful. Disseminate the word, educate others about SWATs, so the wider trial team, the sponsor, all benefit from understanding more about why methodological research is important. And we've developed a range of resources. The animation that I showed you at the start is one of those, and they're available via that QR code, and also there's a link at the end as well if that's useful. If you're inspired, keen to collaborate with other SWATers, then we'd really encourage you to join this Trial Forge SWAT Network as well, which you can do so via the email address there. So just to conclude, the evidence for how to best design, conduct and disseminate trials is limited, and that needs to change. The onus is on us to try and mobilise that. That responsibility is not just for us as trials sort of conduct, but also everyone that's involved, from your sponsors through to your sites and everyone in between. Plan to undertake SWATs routinely in your trials. Include one in every application if you can. Consider where you can fill the evidence gaps, and consider those easy wins in trials that you've already got. Anything like that all adds to the evidence. So, as the animation beautifully said, SWATs, they're a small study playing a big role in making clinical trials better. So thank you for your time. I will stop there, and we can open the floor to questions.